Good evening, and welcome once again. You have found your way back to this quiet corner of the night, where history drifts past like a river under moonlight. I invite you to settle into a comfortable position, perhaps beneath a blanket, perhaps with the faint glow of a lamp nearby, and allow your breathing to slow. Here, stories do not rush. They unfold gently, step by step, as if written not with ink, but with the soft passing of clouds across a darkened sky. Before we begin, let me offer a small reminder. If these stories bring you comfort, if they give you a moment of stillness before sleep, I kindly ask that you take a second to subscribe to the channel, to press the little button that ensures you will not miss the next tale whispered into the dusk. And if you wish, you may also leave a comment below, perhaps sharing your favorite passage or simply saying hello. These small gestures mean more than you might realize. They let this channel grow, and they remind me that someone, somewhere, is listening quietly in the night. Tonight, we turn to a subject that may sound unusual, perhaps even a little mischievous at first glance. The title of our journey speaks of kings. Kings remembered not for their wisdom in governance, nor for the battles they fought, nor even for the laws they left behind. Instead, we remember them for their strangeness, their indulgences, and their eccentricities in matters of desire. In polite company, these are the details often left out of chronicles. Yet, history is not always polite. It is layered with shadows and whispers, with rumors carried by chroniclers who themselves could not resist writing down a scandalous tale. But do not expect drama, nor fire, nor shock. Here, even the strangest of kings will appear as figures half lost in mist. We will walk slowly among them, observing with curiosity, but without haste. Some of these rulers indulged in what chroniclers called perversions, though what one age considers strange, another might call ordinary. Some were cruel in their excesses, others were merely eccentric, drawing more laughter than fear. As we move through their stories, we will pause often, letting silence and imagination fill the spaces between words. It is worth remembering that medieval courts were not places of modern privacy. A king's behavior, whether noble or ignoble, rarely remained hidden. Courtiers observed, servants whispered, and monks recorded. Thus, the pages of history are filled not only with wars and treaties, but with small anecdotes about what kings did behind closed doors, or, in some cases, openly in their halls. These fragments of human weakness remind us that rulers were as flawed, as peculiar, and as restless as any of us. To prepare the ground for these tales, let us step back first into the general atmosphere of the medieval court. Imagine, if you will, a great hall lit by torches, the flames unsteady casting shadows across stone walls. The smell of wax and smoke lingers in the air. Long tables are laid with dishes, and in the evenings, music drifts from the lips of minstrels. Amidst this backdrop, a king might preside, a man both elevated and isolated, the center of attention, yet bound by expectations that few could truly satisfy. Loneliness, power, and the absence of limits often shape the private habits of such men. What one man did quietly in the fields, a king might do loudly in the hall, for no one could restrain him. And so stories accumulated. In the chapters ahead, we will visit figures such as King John of England, whose appetites unsettled his nobles, or Philip IV of France, whose cold demeanor hid strange fixations. We will wander further to less remembered courts, where chroniclers noted kings who turned feasts into carnivals of flesh, and others who sought unusual amusements that today would seem both bizarre and oddly humorous. But we shall not hurry. This first chapter is only the beginning, a setting of tone. We are here to drift, not to race. So let us begin this wandering through history's forgotten chambers. And as we do, allow the rhythm of the words to wash over you slowly, like the sound of rain on an ancient roof, like the breathing of a city long asleep. Good evening once more, dear listener. You are still here, which means you have chosen to remain in this river of history, allowing its gentle current to carry you onward. I am glad you stayed. In the first section, we opened the doors of the medieval hall and spoke softly of kings whose reputations wandered far from the expected path. Tonight, or rather in this next step of our long tale, we shall enter more deeply into that atmosphere, where stone walls held both the majesty and the mischief of rulers. It is important, before turning to individual kings, to pause a while and understand the theater of the medieval court itself. For in truth, the court was always a stage, and kings, even when acting privately, were never fully unseen. Their gestures were observed, their words repeated, their silences noted. A spilled goblet, a whispered remark, or the flicker of an unusual smile could travel quickly down corridors, across markets, and into the pens of chroniclers. And so when we speak of perversions, of kings who strayed into desires or amusements that raised eyebrows, we must remember that we are hearing these tales through a long echo. What we have is not the act itself, but the whispered memory of it, magnified or distorted by the gossip of centuries. Imagine again the great hall, heavy with smoke, its rafters blackened with years of feasts and fires. A king sits at the far end, raised upon a dais, separated from his courtiers by a stretch of polished oak table. At his side, perhaps, a goblet of silver, and beyond that, musicians coaxing melodies from strings. But in the corners of that same room, servants observe with careful eyes. They see more than they are supposed to. They notice when a hand lingers too long, when a guest is called privately after the feast, when the king disappears into chambers with companions who would never otherwise be permitted such closeness. They carry these details, quietly at first, until one day they become part of rumor. And rumor, once inked onto parchment, becomes history. One of the earliest English kings whispered about for his excesses was William II, known as William Rufus, who reigned at the end of the 11th century. He was not remembered as a great legislator, nor as a pious figure, but rather as a man of appetites. Chroniclers described his court as a place of indulgence, a place where men dressed in bright colors, where fashion tilted toward extravagance, and where, it was said, the king surrounded himself with young companions whose beauty was praised more than their loyalty. Was this truly perversion? Or merely a sign of a court tilting toward luxury, where the king delighted in youth, in laughter, and in the company of those who flattered him? To the monks who wrote much of our history, such scenes were scandalous. To the king, perhaps, they were simply a way of easing the burdens of rule. What we know for certain is that his reputation grew, not for kindness nor for faith, but for a restless pursuit of pleasure. He died in a hunting accident, shot by an arrow, though even his death was whispered about as if it carried hidden meaning, as though God himself had tired of the king's excess. In France, we might look at Philip I, who reigned in the late 11th century. His story is less dramatic, but equally telling. Married to Bertha of Holland, he later set her aside to take another woman Bertrade de Montfort, though she was already married to Fulk of Anjou. The scandal was immense, not because a king had taken a mistress, such things were common enough, but because he had done so openly, dismissing his queen and binding himself to another man's wife. The church excommunicated him more than once for this, yet Philip remained unmoved. His appetite, his desire was stronger than the weight of papal commands. Some saw this as perverse stubbornness, others as simple human passion. Either way, the scandal clung to him, and centuries later he remains remembered more for this than for his governance. Let us linger here a while, imagining not the thunder of judgment, but the slow unfolding of daily life within such courts. Imagine servants carrying jugs of spiced wine, pouring it into cups, setting platters of roasted meat upon the table. Imagine the flicker of laughter, a jest made too boldly, a companion leaning closer to the king than etiquette might allow. The music continues, but those who watch see something else. The subtle drift of a monarch beyond the boundaries of expected behavior. It is in these small details, a hand, a glance, a choice of companion, that the seeds of reputation are sown. The chroniclers themselves often described such kings with words that today sound moralistic. They called them sinful, lecherous, or given to vice. But behind these words, if we listen carefully, we hear something else, a tone of fascination. For even monks, bound to vows, could not resist recording these stories. They may have condemned them, but they also preserved them, ensuring that centuries later we too might sit in the quiet of night, reflecting on kings who allowed desire to shape their rule. In England, another monarch who drew scandal was King John, later in the early 13th century. His reign is better known for the Magna Carta, that document which sought to restrain his power. But behind the parchment lies a king remembered as both cruel and lustful. Chroniclers accused him of forcing himself upon noblewomen, of seizing brides on the very day of their weddings, of turning his court into a place where fear mingled with humiliation. His appetites were not tender, but violent, and it is perhaps for this reason that his reputation has remained so dark. The Magna Carta, though a political document, was in part a response to these excesses. Nobles who felt dishonored and threatened gathered together not merely because of taxes, but because the king himself had violated the unspoken bonds of respect within their society. Here, we begin to see a different dimension of perversion, not only indulgence in private desires, but the use of power to satisfy them. This, perhaps, is the true darkness of kingship, when the boundaries of personal want and political authority blur until the two become indistinguishable. For John, the whispers were not merely of eccentricity, but of cruelty. And cruelty, once written, tends to stain more deeply than laughter ever could. Yet, even as we reflect on John's shadowed reign, it is important to soften the pace again. Not every tale is heavy. Some kings were remembered for their oddities in ways that seem almost comical to us now. There were rulers who indulged in excessive feasting, not only of food, but of entertainment, filling their halls with jesters whose performances crossed lines of decency. There were kings who collected lovers as others collected books, surrounding themselves with companions whose presence baffled their nobles. These stories remind us that human nature does not always fit neatly into categories of virtue and vice. It meanders, it stumbles, it experiments, and in the case of rulers, it leaves behind long shadows in the pages of history. As this second section draws on, let us pause and breathe once more. Think of these rulers not as villains, nor as heroes, but as men caught between the weight of their crowns and the pull of their desires. They lived in times when the boundaries of morality were enforced by the church, yet constantly tested by power. They left behind not only laws and wars, but whispers that reach us still, across the distance of centuries. And so, as the candles burn lower in the halls of memory, we shall continue our wandering. In the next section, we will look more closely at how chroniclers themselves shape these reputations, choosing what to record, what to exaggerate, and what to leave hidden. For history, after all, is not simply what happened, but what was written. And in the case of kings, it was often the strangest details that survived. Good evening again, dear listener. You have remained with me through the opening of this strange but gentle subject. And now we travel deeper into the shadows of parchment and ink. The kings we spoke of before, William Rufus with his youthful companions, Philip of France with his scandalous marriage, and John of England with his cruel appetites, all reached us not through the naked light of fact, but through the dim lanterns of chroniclers. It is worth slowing here, very deliberately, and reflecting on how such stories came to us. For without those monks, scribes, and court writers, we would know almost nothing of these men's so-called perversions. Kings lived surrounded by silence and secrecy. But words, once written, break through walls, and once written, they last. The monks and their pens, much of medieval history was recorded in monasteries. Imagine, if you will, a Benedictine monk seated at a heavy wooden desk. Before him lies parchment, stretched and smoothed, and beside him a small horn of ink, dark as midnight. He bends forward, quill in hand, and scratches slowly across the surface. His task may be to copy the Gospels, but on the margins of his labor, he adds notes of his own time, rumors of war, the death of a noble, the scandal of a king. The monastery was not a place untouched by gossip. News traveled along the same roads as merchants, pilgrims, and crusaders. By the time it reached the cloister, it was shaped by many tongues. Yet once written down by a monk, it gained authority. What had begun as a whisper at a banquet might, on parchment, take the weight of truth. And so, when we read of a king's perversions, we must remember the quiet hand behind it. The monk may have disapproved of bright colors, of feasts, of laughter at court. And so he wrote of these things as sin. He may have been scandalized by rumors of lust or cruelty. And so he wrote them as warnings. What he condemned, we now inherit as history. The taste for scandal. There is also the simple truth that people, then as now, were drawn to the strange, the shocking, and the shameful. A record of taxes or treaties might serve scholars, but a tale of a king who took lovers in forbidden ways, or mocked the sacraments, or turned his court into a carnival. Such stories were irresistible. They traveled more easily. They survived because they were repeated. Consider, for example, the tales told of Edward II of England, a king whose reign in the early 14th century was overshadowed by both politics and passion. Chroniclers wrote, with tones of disapproval, of his close relationship with Piers Gaveston, a companion who was described less as a nobleman and more as a beloved favorite. Some wrote that Edward indulged him with jewels, titles, and endless affection. Others hinted more darkly, suggesting desires that in their time were seen as unnatural. Was this truth? Was it exaggeration? Or was it a mixture? A companionship made scandalous by the quills of monks who saw sin where there was only love? We cannot know with certainty. What we can know is that Edward's reputation was forever shaped by these writings. His downfall, his deposition, and his terrible death, said to be carried out with grotesque cruelty, were all framed by the chroniclers within the language of punishment for a king's perverse attachments. It is in this way that scandal becomes legacy. The role of rumor. Let us pause here and imagine rumor itself as a kind of wind, moving silently through corridors, carrying words from ear to ear. Rumor was often the first draft of history. A servant sees a door close late at night, and he tells another. A knight overhears laughter, and he repeats it to his squire. By the time it reaches the hall of a bishop, the story has grown. When the bishop whispers it to a monk, and the monk inks it on parchment, rumor is transformed into history. Yet the pace is never hurried. These tales did not travel with the speed of a letter sent today. They moved slowly, sometimes over months, sometimes over years. And so what we hold in our hands now, in chronicles and annals, are the settled sediments of gossip, words that once drifted like dust through halls, now hardened like stone into memory, perverted or human. We should also pause to ask ourselves, what did these medieval writers mean by the word perverted? The word itself did not exist in their time in the way we use it today. To them, it often meant anything that deviated from the path of the church. A king who married the wrong woman, a king who drank too much wine, a king who preferred men to women, or even a king who dressed in clothes that were considered too fancy. All of these could be recorded as sins, as vices, as deviations. What seems scandalous in the Chronicles may seem very human to us. Who among us has not yearned, deviated, or sought solace in strange ways? But when a king did this, it became not just personal, but political. For his body was the body of the kingdom. His desires were seen as shaping the fate of the kingdom itself. If the king was sinful, perhaps the land would suffer famine. If the king was licentious, perhaps the war would be lost. Such was the medieval imagination, where the private life of the ruler was directly linked to the fate of his people. And so in this chapter, I invite you to think of the chronicler not as a neutral chronicler, but as a man with his own tastes, fears, and passions. His pen trembled not only with the Psalms, but also with the temptation of stories. He wrote of kings who indulged themselves excessively, of rulers who mocked custom, of monarchs who fell into strange habits because they could not resist them. And while he may have intended these stories as cautionary tales, he gave us something else, a tapestry of human frailty, delicately embroidered on the margins of history. As we conclude this chapter, let us once again dim the torches of the monastery. Imagine the scribe laying down his pen, closing his eyes for a moment as the candles fade. Outside, night presses against the windows. Inside, the ink dries, carrying with it the shadow of the king's reputation. In the next chapter, we move from the chroniclers to the courts themselves, examining how the architecture, rituals, and ceremonies of royal power provided the perfect backdrop for scandals to flourish. For if the court was the stage, then the halls, gardens, and chambers were the scenery on which these strange performances took place. And as always, let the words envelop you like the evening silence, reminding you that history is not always made up of great battles, but of the quiet whispers that still echo even in your dreams. We have taken another step on this long and silent journey. We have seen kings as individuals and chroniclers as makers of memory. But it is time to turn our gaze outward, to the places where these kings lived and moved, to the courts that embodied their desires and served as the stage for their eccentricities. For the court was not only a place of power, it was also a theater, a closed world where rituals, feasts, and private entertainments took place against a backdrop of stone and tapestries. To understand how the so-called perversions of kings were observed, repeated, and remembered, we must first slow down and imagine the rooms in which they took place. The heart of almost every medieval palace or castle was the Great Hall. Imagine a long rectangular room, its high roof supported by beams darkened by centuries of smoke. The narrow windows at the sides let in little light, so torches and candles filled the air with flickering shadows. At the far end, on a rise, stood the royal table. Raised above the others, a small but constant reminder of hierarchy. Here, the king's every gesture was in plain sight. If he laughed too loudly, hundreds could hear it. If he embraced one companion, everyone could see it. The hall magnified every pleasure. The banquets themselves were often an occasion for excess. Jesters performed crude dances, musicians played obscene songs, and goblets of spiced wine flowed more freely than the priests approved. A single banquet could last for hours, sometimes days. And in such relaxed moments, kings could be at once the most enthusiastic and the most condemned. Charles VI of France, remembered as the Mad King, is said to have joined his courtiers in a bizarre dance at one such banquet, where they dressed as savages, covered in tar and hair. Torches caught one of them, and in the chaos, several dancers were burned alive. Charles himself survived, but the memory of a king who had participated in such bizarre entertainments clung to his reign, fueling an image of instability and excess. However, beyond the hall, beyond the music and torches, there were other spaces, quieter and more hidden. The royal chambers, separated by thick curtains or heavy doors, were a place where fewer eyes could penetrate, but from there rumors often began. Servants came in to bring water, clothes, or to make the bed. They noticed the presence of guests who lingered long after others had left. They carried with them whispers from the kitchens and stables that later reached the chroniclers. Many strange anecdotes are said to have taken place in these hidden chambers. Some kings surrounded themselves with favorites of dubious reputations. Others held private entertainments that shocked the few who saw them. For example, Edward II of England is said to have preferred the company of his favorites even in the bedrooms, where queens might otherwise have held sway. Whether these stories are true or exaggerated is hardly relevant. One thing is certain: such rumors could not be contained by walls. Thus, the room was both a sanctuary and a trap, a place of intimacy that, paradoxically, produced the very stories that ruined reputations. The daily life of the king was full of rituals, religious ceremonies, feasts, processions, coronations. These were moments designed to display order, to demonstrate piety, to present the king as God's chosen ruler. Yet even here, beneath the surface, there was room for mischief. Coronations, for example, were grand and solemn, but the feasting often descended into excess afterward, tables breaking under the weight of the food, and jesters mocking even the sacred. Freed from the strain of ceremony, kings sometimes indulged themselves to the point of appalling the church. Chroniclers tell us that queens were sometimes neglected at these times, replaced by lesser companions, or that dances were performed with a debauchery that seemed almost pagan. It was in this tension between ritual purity and human desire that scandal was born. The church demanded dignity, the people demanded spectacle, and the king, squeezed between them, often inclined to indulge. For indulgence was easier, warmer, and far more tempting than restraint. Nor should we forget the spaces outside the hall. The royal gardens, carefully fenced, were places where kings could stroll with their companions away from the eyes of the court. These gardens were designed not only for beauty, but also for solitude. Winding paths, arbors shaded by hedges, fountains that murmured softly in the twilight. What went on there was rarely seen, but often guessed at. It was in the realm of guesswork that scandal flourished most freely. Hunting was also both public and private. Kings rode out with their companions, but in the wilderness, with their servants and nobles scattered at a distance. There was room for other indulgences. Chroniclers sometimes hinted at strange behavior during these hunts, whether excessive cruelty to animals or suspicious affection for pets. Thus, hunting became not just deer hunting, but also hunting at will. As we slowly move through these spaces, hall, chamber, garden, hunting ground, we see how the architecture and rituals of court life reflected the human condition. The public and the private were unsettlingly intertwined. Every wall provided both shelter and suspicion. Every feast provided both joy and fuel for scandal. It is no wonder, then, that the reputations of kings were intertwined with excess. The very places where they lived amplified each act, transforming what might have been ordinary in a peasant hut into the stuff of legend when it took place under vaulted ceilings. The hall is silent, littered with cups and leftover food. Torches flicker softly. Servants clear tables, whispering to each other. Behind closed doors, the king rests, or perhaps entertains. Outside, in the gardens, fountains murmur, as if remembering all they have seen. It was here, in these vast and secret spaces, that kings left behind not only their laws and wars, but also their secrets. And it was here that the stage was set for chroniclers to write of the perversions, eccentricities, and scandals that still resonate in our own time. We return to the grand stage of the medieval palace, a place where kings displayed not only their power, but also their weaknesses. The stone walls, the gilded halls, and the quiet chambers all acted as amplifiers of desire. Some kings were remembered simply for their feasting, others for their cruelty, and still others for eccentricities so striking that we still whisper about them centuries later. Charles VI ascended the French throne in the late 14th century, and although he began his reign with promise, he soon became notorious for his mental disorders. Chroniclers described sudden outbursts of rage, periods of confusion when he could not remember his own name, and strange fits of behavior that bewildered his court. It was in this fog of instability that the king's so-called perversions were recorded. Banquets during his reign sometimes became spectacles of excess, blurring the line between courtly entertainment and dangerous folly. The infamous Bal des Ardents, the ball of burning men, is perhaps the most striking example. One winter evening, Charles and several of his companions dressed as savages, smearing their bodies with pitch and flax to perform a dance before the court. They leapt and howled, embodying untamed forest creatures. But when a torch was brought too close, the costumes burst into flames, and several men were burned alive in front of the horrified guests. The king himself was saved only by the quick action of his aunt, who hid him under her skirts. What was this but a court transformed into a carnival of grotesque pleasures? Was it madness? A misjudgment? or a form of ritual gone astray. Chroniclers described it as evidence that the king was unfit, absorbed in strange amusements. Yet when we pause and imagine the scene, the flickering torches, the laughter of the dancers, the sudden burst of flame, we see not only the absurdity, but also the fragile humanity of a ruler seeking salvation in a dangerous game. Henry III of Castile, the sick king and hidden excess. Further south in Castile, we meet Henry III, who reigned in the late 14th century. Known as Henry the Weak, he was in poor health, but his court was not without scandal. Chroniclers, perhaps exaggerating, spoke of indulgences that contrasted with his frail constitution. While his body was frail, his appetites, they say, were not. His court became known for entertainments that bordered on the sleazy, banquets that ended in drunkenness, jesters whose humor bordered on obscenity, and companions whose closeness to the king aroused suspicion. The architecture of his palaces, especially in Seville and Valladolid, provided many private places for such pleasures. Tiled rooms with cooling fountains, gardens surrounded by high walls, and rooms hung with heavy curtains to muffle sound. Rumors of what went on in these spaces became more complicated than what might actually have happened. In the silence of these shaded gardens, courtiers whispered of strange feelings, of favorites granted unusual privileges, of indulgences unfit for a king weakened by illness. Perhaps Henry sought in these pleasures relief from the constant reminder of his frail body. And although his reign was not disastrous, the shadows of rumors clung to him, mixing his image as an ailing monarch with that of a ruler prone to excesses. To the east, in Bohemia, lived Wenceslas IV, son of Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire. His reign in the late 14th and early 15th centuries is remembered less for governance, more for his remarkable neglect of royal duty. Chroniclers tell us that he preferred taverns to council chambers, and that he surrounded himself with companions who encouraged his indulgences. Where his father had been remembered as a model of piety and order, Wenceslas was remembered as the opposite. A king who abandoned solemnity for drink, for feasting, for pursuits that blurred the dignity of the crown. His palaces were still grand, but he was more often found in the company of commoners in the taverns of Prague. Rumors grew of his behavior there, of crude entertainments, of drunken violence, of companions who enjoyed privileges far beyond their station. The nobles of his kingdom grew restless, seeing in his indulgences a threat not only to his reputation, but to the stability of the realm. It was said that he even locked up churchmen who displeased him. A shocking act in an age where the church stood at the heart of authority. In Wenceslas, we see how architecture shaped reputation in another way. The grand palace, left empty while the king drank elsewhere, became a silent symbol of neglect. The absence of the king from his proper stage created its own scandal. For in medieval imagination, the king was meant to embody the dignity of his court. When he instead preferred the shadows of taverns, his crown itself seemed tarnished. When we place these rulers side by side, Charles VI in his fiery dances, Henry III in his shaded gardens, Wenceslas IV in his noisy taverns, a pattern begins to emerge. Each court became the stage upon which a particular form of excess played out. The architecture, the rituals, and the private chambers did not merely contain their behaviors, they magnified them. For Charles, the great hall turned madness into spectacle. For Henry, the private chamber turned frailty into whispered scandal. For Wenceslas, the tavern turned neglect into open shame. The spaces they inhabited shaped the way their reputation survived. what a peasant might have done unnoticed in a village hut became legendary when enacted in a palace or a tavern under the gaze of servants and scribes. To drift forward in time, beyond the Middle Ages and into the late Renaissance, we encounter Henry III of France, whose reign in the late 16th century was marked by a reputation for strangeness, devotion, and scandal. Chroniclers and pamphleteers of his day could scarcely resist describing the Mignons, his elegant young courtiers who followed him everywhere, dressed in rich silks, adorned with jewels, and perfumed with rare scents. The word mignon itself carried layers of meaning. To some it meant simply a favorite, a companion, a youth distinguished by beauty. To others, it hinted at intimacy, at affection that went beyond propriety. Henry's enemies seized upon the image of a king surrounded by handsome men, mocking his masculinity and questioning his authority. Whether or not Henry's affection for his mignons was physical, it was certainly extravagant. He gave them positions, titles, and gifts that angered the nobility. He dressed them in fashions that were ridiculed as effeminate, and he spent hours in their company rather than in the council chamber. In truth, the scandal of the Mignons was less about their actions and more about what they represented. The idea that the king valued beauty and intimacy over dignity and governance. Henry's court became, in the eyes of his critics, a stage of frivolity and perversity, where the line between companion and lover was blurred beneath a cloud of perfume and candlelight. Further north, in Scotland, we find another figure sometimes drawn into the tapestry of scandal. James I, who reigned in the early 15th century after years of captivity in England. James was remembered as a poet, a lover of music, and a man of passions. Chroniclers, often hostile, hinted at indulgences that seemed unkingly. They spoke of his fondness for pageants, of his closeness to certain companions, and of a court that, under his reign, became known as a place of entertainment and leisure. Later, writers accused him of connivance, suggesting he looked away from the excesses of his favorites, permitting behavior that others would have condemned. These allegations may have been exaggerated, shaped by political enemies who sought to tarnish his reputation. Yet the whispers lingered. They remind us once again that in the medieval imagination, a king's companions were more than private friends. They were seen as reflections of his soul, mirrors of his morality. If his companion sinned, the stain was believed to spread to the crown itself. Not all scandals centered on male favorites. Some of the most enduring tales of perverted kingship arose from the uneasy balance between queens and mistresses. The queen, in theory, was the embodiment of legitimacy. She carried the sacred role of producing heirs, of embodying virtue, of supporting the king with dignity. Yet often she was set aside, humiliated by the presence of another woman whose beauty or charm drew the king's eye. Take, for example, Alfonso XI of Castile and Leonor de Guzman, whom we mentioned earlier. While Queen Maria of Portugal endured neglect, Leonor became not only the king's lover, but his political partner. Her children granted privileges as though they were legitimate heirs. The scandal here was twofold: the betrayal of the queen and the elevation of a mistress into a position that destabilized the order of the realm. In France, centuries later, the situation repeated in different forms. Queens remained symbols of legitimacy, but mistresses became symbols of desire. Chroniclers often painted them as temptresses, yet it was the king who bore the stain of indulgence. A ruler who preferred a mistress to his queen was seen as perverting not only morality, but the very structure of kingship. And yet, in the softer light of hindsight, we may see something more human. These were men bound to political marriages, unions arranged for alliances rather than affection. Is it surprising that they sought love elsewhere? To their contemporaries, this was scandal. To us, it may appear as longing. The universal search for intimacy, complicated only by the fact that it wore a crown. It is important to note that companions, whether favorites, mistresses, or friends, were often used as weapons in the political struggle of the time. When the nobility wanted to weaken the king, they accused him of excessive, too strange, or too wrong love. When rivals tried to undermine power, they mocked the company with which he associated. Thus, the companions of kings were not just people. They were symbols, rhetorical devices depicted in the chronicles to represent disorder, corruption, or sin. A favorite symbolized inappropriate favor. A mistress symbolized indulgence. A companion in a tavern symbolized vulgarity. And a queen, neglected, symbolized broken order. In due course, let us return once more to the silence of the medieval night court. In one room, the king rests next to his favorite, whispering words that no chronicler could truly hear. In another, a mistress lurks in the queen's shadow, her presence shifting the balance of power. In another, servants whisper of jewels given too generously, of laughter that lasted too long, of embraces seen when they shouldn't have been seen. All these moments, real or imagined, have been recorded in ink and passed down to us as scandal, as perversion, as weakness. Yet when we listen carefully, beneath the condemnation, we hear something softer. The eternal truth that kings, like all men, sought love, companionship, and escape. If you are still with me, then you have already walked through the stone halls of palaces, you have glimpsed the favorites of kings, and you have listened to the whispers of companions. Now, I invite you to sit at the long wooden tables of the medieval feast. Here, in the flicker of torchlight, indulgence takes another form. The table becomes a mirror of the king's nature, generous or greedy, restrained or wild, pious or perverse. To eat was to show power. To drink was to display control, or its absence. And so, many of the strangest tales of kings are told not in bedrooms, but at the banquet table. A great hall stretches before you, its walls hung with banners and tapestries. The air is thick with the smell of roasted meats, venison glazed with honey, geese stuffed with herbs, boars' heads crowned with fruit. Platters of fish gleam with sauce, and bowls of pottage steam in the cold air. Alongside the food flows wine, sweet and spiced, poured endlessly into goblets of silver and gold. At the high table sits the king, his plate larger, his goblet richer, his portion greater than all others. Every eye watches him, how he eats, how he drinks, how he laughs. If he raises his cup too often, whispers stir. If he calls for entertainment that strays too far into vulgarity, the chroniclers take note. The feast is not only sustenance, it is theater, ritual, and revelation. Not all feasts were wild. Some kings used the table to display virtue. Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire, father of Wenceslas, held banquets where food was abundant but carefully measured, where prayers were long, and where sobriety was praised. Chroniclers admired his restraint, contrasting it later with the indulgence of his son. This contrast reveals something important. A king's relationship to the table shaped not only his own reputation, but that of his dynasty. A sober feast was remembered as piety, an extravagant one as perversion. Wenceslas IV of Bohemia. Drunken feasts, his son Wenceslas IV, as we have seen, preferred another path. Chroniclers described his feasts as tavern-like, with wine flowing too freely and discipline collapsing into laughter and violence. He is said to have humiliated bishops by dousing them with drink, mocking their piety while favoring his common companions. Such stories painted him as not merely indulgent, but unkingly. The table, meant to embody order, became under him a place of chaos. His drunkenness was described not as private folly, but as a perversion of kingship itself. Charles VI of France, the Feast of Madness. We return once more to Charles VI of France, whose instability colored even his meal times. Chroniclers tell us that he sometimes refused to bathe or change clothes, appearing at table in disarray. At other times, he indulged in excessive eating and drinking, his companions mocking him with foolish entertainments. One story tells of him refusing food altogether, convinced that he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. His refusal to eat became itself a spectacle, the perversion of the feast, where abundance was turned into emptiness. Though later than the medieval period, the feasting of Henry VIII of England casts a long shadow backward. His tables groaned with roasted oxen, swans, and pies filled with exotic ingredients. Chroniclers marveled not only at the abundance, but at the king's personal indulgence. His growing girth became symbolic of his appetite, both for food and for other desires. Though not medieval in the strictest sense, Henry's reputation reminds us that the table was often the stage where private perversions became public legend. For the king's body, swollen with excess, was seen as the reflection of his soul. Food was not the only indulgence of the feast. Entertainment often blurred the line between celebration and obscenity. Minstrels sang songs filled with bawdy humor. Jesters performed lewd dances. At some courts, performers staged masks. Plays filled with allegories of desire, where courtiers dressed as gods, satyrs, or animals. Some chroniclers wrote of kings who laughed too loudly at crude jokes, or who demanded entertainments that shocked even hardened courtiers. To feast was not only to eat, but to abandon restraint. And the chronicles preserve these moments as warnings, as evidence of excess. Outside the feast, leisure itself could become scandal. The hunt, the tournament, the game of dice, all were opportunities for kings to indulge. When a king hunted too much, it was said he neglected governance. When he gambled, it was said he wasted the wealth of the realm. When he lingered too long in gardens, surrounded by companions, it was said he abandoned duty for pleasure. The leisure of kings was never only leisure. It was always watched, always measured, always judged. And when it crossed into excess, it became remembered as perversion. When we step back, we see clearly that the table was a symbol of kingship itself. At the feast, the king showed his nature. A restrained table meant virtue. An abundant table meant generosity. A wild table meant perversion. Chroniclers, ever eager to capture scandal, wrote of the feasts where kings drank too deeply, where companions misbehaved, where queens were ignored, and where mistresses sat in places of honor. These moments, fleeting in their own time, became eternal in ink. The night grows quieter, and our steps carry us deeper into the heart of medieval imagination. If you close your eyes, you might almost hear the soft turning of parchment, or the murmur of prayers in a cold chapel, or the hushed voice of a servant whispering about omens. For the medieval world was steeped in ritual and superstition. It was believed that the actions of a king were never truly private. His sins might call down famine, and his lusts might provoke storms, his cruelty might summon plague. In this way, the desires of kings became not merely scandals. They became cosmic disturbances, signs that heaven itself was watching and disapproving. Kings were expected to embody sacred order. Their coronations were filled with rituals of purity, anointing with holy oil, blessings with relics, solemn oaths before the altar. These rites painted the king's body as more than flesh. It was symbolic, the vessel of God's will on earth. Yet this symbolism made the king's private actions all the more dangerous. When he strayed, he was not only a man sinning against God, he was the anointed one, polluting a sacred vessel. Chroniclers saw this as a kind of desecration. Thus, when Edward II lingered too fondly with Piers Gaveston, or when Charles VI joined his companions in foolish dances, their actions were described not only as perverse, but as violations of sacred kingship. The medieval imagination was rich with omens. If the crops failed, perhaps the king's sins were to blame. If lightning struck a church, perhaps it was a warning against the ruler's indulgence. Consider King John of England, whose lust and cruelty provoked rebellion. Chroniclers claim that storms, floods, and famine during his reign were punishments from God, brought about by the king's sins. To them, the natural world reflected the perversions of the ruler. In France, during the troubled reign of Charles VI, madness was seen not merely as illness, but as divine retribution. His strange behaviors, his sudden fits, were interpreted as punishment for indulgence and folly. Every misfortune in the kingdom was tied back to his excesses, as though his body and the realm were one. Among the common folk, stories of perverted kings took on the shape of folklore. In taverns and markets, it was said that a lustful king would cause rivers to flood, that a cruel king would bring wolves into villages, that a gluttonous king would darken the sun. These were not scientific connections. They were symbolic, born of the deep belief that rulers and nature were bound together. Even queens and mistresses were drawn into these superstitions. A mistress who charmed the king was sometimes accused of sorcery. Leonor de Guzman, the mistress of Alfonso XI of Castile, was whispered to have bewitched him. Her beauty turned into enchantment. Later, mistresses at French courts were accused of carrying charms, potions, or talismans that bound kings to their will. In these tales, the king was not simply a sinner. He was a victim of sorcery, ensnared by unnatural forces. This explanation softened the scandal. The king had not chosen perversion. He had been bewitched into it. When kings fell, rituals of humiliation often accompanied their downfall. Edward II, deposed by his queen and her ally, was not simply removed from the throne. Chroniclers describe his captivity as filled with cruel symbolic punishments. A king reduced to nothing, his body mocked as much as his crown. His rumored death by a hot poker was told not only as an act of cruelty, but as a punishment fit for a man accused of unnatural desires. Whether true or not, the story reveals the power of ritual thinking. The king who perverted the order of nature, it was said, must die by a perverted death. The symbolism was as important as the act itself. There were also rituals of healing connected to kings. In England and France, it was believed that the monarch could cure scrofula, the king's evil, by touching the afflicted. Pilgrims lined up for this miraculous touch, believing the king carried divine grace in his hands. Yet when a king was accused of perversion, these rituals were called into question. Could a sinful king still heal? Could hands that caressed mistresses or favorites still carry divine power? Such doubts lingered, whispered by those who feared that the king's indulgence polluted not only his soul, but the very rituals of kingship. Let us begin with Richard II of England, whose reign in the late 14th century was colored not only by politics and rebellion, but by omens. Chroniclers of his time and later often described signs in the sky, strange weather, or unnatural events as reflections of his character and his failures. Richard, like Edward II before him, was accused of excessive affection for favorites, of neglecting his queen, and of indulging in entertainments that seemed frivolous to a kingdom strained by war. These personal weaknesses were mirrored in the minds of his contemporaries by disorder in nature itself. A storm, a poor harvest, or the appearance of a comet was seized upon as divine commentary on the king's sins. When Richard was eventually deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, omens were said to have foretold it: darkened skies, comets blazing, and beasts behaving strangely. To later writers, these signs were not coincidences. They were proof that heaven itself had judged Richard's perversions and declared his reign unfit. In this way, superstition gave meaning to politics. Richard's fall was not only the result of rebellion, it was, in the medieval imagination, the inevitable punishment of a king whose indulgences had unbalanced the world. A century earlier in France, another king's reputation was framed through the lens of superstition. Louis VI, known to history as Louis the Fat, reigned in the early 12th century. His great girth became both a physical reality and a moral symbol. Chroniclers, writing with a mixture of disdain and fascination, portrayed his size not merely as the result of feasting, but as a sign of gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins. In their telling, his body became an allegory. Each pound of flesh was seen as divine punishment, a visible mark of indulgence. His difficulty in movement, his labored breathing, were described not as natural effects of age or appetite, but as warnings from God about the dangers of excess. Yet Louis was not remembered as a weak king. He was active in consolidating royal authority and defending the crown's interests. But the chroniclers could not resist turning his appetite into a lesson, a reminder that even kings were bound to divine law, and that gluttony carried spiritual consequences. His body became a sermon in itself, proof that perversion of appetite could not be hidden, but must be displayed upon the very flesh of the ruler. Beyond the writings of monks and chroniclers, there were the whispers of the people, folk prophecies, half believed, half feared, that circulated through markets, taverns, and pilgrim roads. These prophecies often tied the fate of kingdoms to the private sins of rulers. One such tale told that a lustful king would bring down his own dynasty, his indulgence seeding rebellion. Another warned that a king who mocked the church would die in shame. These prophecies often appeared after the fact, shaped to fit events. But they reveal how deeply the medieval mind linked morality and fate. Consider again Edward II. His downfall was described not only as rebellion, but as the fulfillment of prophecy, that a king who loved unnaturally would die unnaturally. The cruel story of his death by a heated poker, though likely apocryphal, was framed as proof of prophecy fulfilled. Or think of Charles VI, whose madness was foretold, some said, by omens at his birth. When he later dressed in strange costumes or attacked his own companions in fits of confusion, these events were folded into folk belief. The mad king was cursed from the start, his perversions merely the flowering of destiny. Even queens were not free from such tales. Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, was cast in later chronicles as the she-wolf of France, fulfilling a prophecy that a French queen would destroy England. In truth, she was a political actor, leading rebellion against her husband. Yet, in the language of superstition, her role was transformed into something inevitable, foretold, and monstrous. When we draw these threads together, the omens of Richard II, the gluttony of Louis VI, the prophecies surrounding Edward II and Charles VI, we see how the medieval world imagined kingship as more than governance. The king was a node in the cosmic balance. His indulgence disturbed the heavens, his lust angered the earth, his cruelty warped the flow of history. A king's perversion was never his alone. It was believed to ripple outward through crops and storms, through famine and rebellion, until the entire kingdom trembled. This is why chronicles dwell so heavily on scandal. To them, scandal was not mere gossip. It was a diagnosis of imbalance, a symptom of a world where order had been disturbed by a ruler's desires. The day in the medieval palace stretches onward, and we find ourselves in the stillness of the afternoon. Morning rituals have passed, prayers, petitions, councils, and perhaps the grand feast. Now, the light through high windows begins to soften, and the day drifts toward a slower rhythm. These are the hours when kings linger in gardens, when they retreat to chambers, when they meet companions in smaller groups, or wander through entertainments less formal than the morning's grandeur. Yet even in these quiet intervals, the king's presence is watched and his actions noted. For in the medieval world, the hours of the afternoon were not private. They were another stage upon which his reputation was written. Often the early afternoon was devoted to councils. Nobles, bishops, and advisors gathered in smaller chambers, away from the noise of the great hall. The air here was heavy, not with feasting but with parchment, seals, and the scent of ink. Yet scandal could creep even into these solemn hours. Chroniclers complained of kings distracted by favorites who attended the council, whispering jokes while matters of law were debated. Edward II, it was said, brought Piers Gaveston even into moments of governance, placing him where serious men thought he did not belong. Wenceslas of Bohemia, as we know, often neglected council altogether, preferring instead the pleasures of taverns, so that the afternoon hours of duty became hours of absence. The neglect of counsel was not written as mere idleness. It was cast as perversion, the twisting of duty into indulgence, of responsibility into folly. When counsel ended, kings often retreated to their private chambers. Here, curtains softened the light, cushions were laid, and servants moved quietly, carrying wine, fruit, or sweetmeats. These hours could be spent in rest, but just as often they were filled with companions, favorites, or mistresses. Rumors frequently began in these afternoons. Servants noticed when a visitor lingered longer than expected, when laughter echoed through the chamber door, when a queen was absent, but another figure present. Chroniclers later painted these moments as the true heart of scandal, as though every quiet afternoon was charged with hidden excess. Henry III of France, surrounded by his mignons, was often accused of spending these hours in frivolous conversation, perfumed rooms filled with laughter, rather than in the duties of governance. Chroniclers, hostile to him, described these afternoons as wasted. Hours turned from statecraft into indulgence. Another scene of afternoon leisure was the royal garden. Enclosed by walls, laid with fountains, orchards, and shaded paths. The garden was a place of both beauty and secrecy. Kings walked here with companions, often away from the heavy gaze of court. But secrecy in a court was always fragile. If the king laughed too closely with a companion, if he walked too slowly with a mistress, if he plucked fruit and shared it in symbolic intimacy, the gesture was noted. Gardens, meant for peace, became remembered as settings of scandal. Charles VI of France was said to wander aimlessly through gardens in his madness, conversing with companions in strange ways, indulging in games and distractions while the kingdom strained under war. Richard II, too, was remembered for retreating into ornamental gardens with Robert de Vere. Their closeness contrasted with the weight of England's struggles. The garden, then, was both sanctuary and stage, a place where rumor grew like ivy along the walls. The passing hours also brought games, dice, chess, music, or hunting if the weather allowed. Here, too, scandal could be found. A king who gambled too heavily was accused of wasting the realm's fortune. A king who lost his temper at dice was said to reveal a disordered soul. One chronicler wrote of Wenceslas IV wasting afternoons with dice and wine, his companions laughing loudly while petitions of his people lay unanswered. Another hinted at Alfonso XI of Castile preferring music and mistresses to the duties of office, afternoons drifting away in song and indulgence. Even music could carry suspicion. Henry III of Castile, fragile of health, was said to linger too long with musicians and jesters, the afternoons of kingship slipping into entertainments more fitting for taverns than palaces. It is worth pausing here to reflect on the rhythm itself. The medieval day was shaped by bells and candles, by prayers and meals. Afternoon hours were softer than the morning, more private, less ceremonious. But in that very softness lay danger. The king, unguarded, was most himself. And whatever he did in these hours, whether noble or indulgent, became the measure of his character in the eyes of those who whispered and wrote. Thus, the afternoon became symbolic. A king who spent it in council was remembered as dutiful. A king who wasted it in drink was remembered as perverse. A king who spent it in gardens with companions was remembered as indulgent. The smallest choice carried weight, for the king's hours were never truly his own. As the sun lowers in the medieval sky, shadows lengthen across stone courtyards. The great hall grows quiet, the garden falls into shade, the chamber curtains are drawn. Another afternoon has passed, filled, perhaps, with duty, perhaps with indulgence, perhaps with secrets that will never be fully known. To the chroniclers, these hours were fertile ground for scandal. To us, centuries later, they appear as fragments of humanity, moments of idleness, affection, distraction, or weakness that remind us that kings were men, bound by times and temptation. The medieval day moves now into twilight. The sun dips low beyond the walls of the palace, the sky fading from gold to purple, and torches are lit in the courtyards. Shadows stretch long across stone floors, and the court begins its transformation from the ordered duties of day to the loosened rhythms of night. Evening was not a time of silence. It was a time when moods shifted, when courtiers relaxed, when the king himself often revealed a side less bound by ceremony. If mornings were for rituals and afternoons for duties, then evenings were for pleasures, for companionship, and for indulgences that often stirred whispers of scandal. Picture the great hall once more, but now lit by dozens of torches and candelabra. The air is thicker with smoke. Shadows dance along the walls, and the music of lutes and flutes drifts softly across the tables. Servants move quietly, filling cups of wine, setting out sweetmeats, and stoking fires against the chill. The king, weary of councils and audiences, softens into laughter. He may call for musicians, for jesters, for dancers. The atmosphere is at once lighter and more dangerous. The boundaries of order blur in the firelight. It is in this glow that scandal often grew. What might have been hidden in daylight could no longer be contained once wine loosened tongues and torches cast every gesture in sharper contrast. Chroniclers of Richard II of England often described him as a king drawn to display, particularly in the evenings. He surrounded himself with luxuries, tapestries of gold, jeweled goblets, clothes of silk and velvet. His companions, Robert de Vere among them, shared in these theatrics, their closeness more visible when the court gathered in the softened mood of twilight. Nobles complained that the king lingered too long in these entertainments, neglecting affairs of state while favoring his friends with gifts and laughter. To the chroniclers, these evenings were not moments of joy, but of corruption, proof that the king's heart leaned more toward beauty and indulgence than toward duty. For Charles VI of France, the evenings were often unpredictable. At times he joined his courtiers in dances and entertainments, indulging in music and laughter. At other times, he fell into dark moods, withdrawing into silence, his madness stealing upon him as the light faded. Chroniclers wrote of evenings when Charles stared into the fire, refusing to speak, or when he suddenly lashed out at companions in fits of rage. The shift of light seemed to mirror the shift of his mind, from warmth to shadow, from indulgence to violence. In this, the evening glow became not a comfort, but a reminder of fragility, a court balanced between laughter and fear. In Bohemia, Wenceslas IV was remembered less for glittering halls than for his preference for taverns. Evening for him was not ceremony, but drink. Chroniclers accused him of spending these hours in vulgar company, laughing loudly, overturning order with wine-soaked indulgence. In the imagination of his critics, these tavern evenings were not harmless. They were a perversion of kingship. The king, meant to shine with dignity in torch-lit halls, instead drank like a commoner. His crown was dimmed not by nightfall, but by his choices. Evenings were also the time when queens and mistresses, companions and favorites were most visible. Seated at tables, sharing in music, or quietly slipping into chambers after dusk. Their presence shaped the mood of the palace. A mistress placed at the king's side during an evening feast was seen as a public humiliation of the queen. A favorite who lingered too close to the king's chair became the symbol of indulgence. In these moments, desire was no longer hidden. It glowed as brightly as the torches, visible to all. Chroniclers seized on these evenings, recording not only the faces at the king's side, but the mood of the room. Who smiled, who frowned, who whispered discontent. For an evening glow, scandal was magnified. To the medieval imagination, the shift from daylight to firelight carried symbolism. Day was order, night was danger. Day was reason, night was desire. And the evening glow, caught between the two, was the liminal space where order softened into indulgence. Kings who held steady in this glow were remembered as disciplined. Kings who gave in to desire were remembered as perverse. And so, each evening became a test, silently judged by courtiers and later enshrined in chronicles. The court of Henry III of Castile, remembered as El Doliente, the infirm, was marked by contrast. In daylight, he appeared as a frail ruler, weakened by illness, his body thin and his movements slow. Yet in the evenings, he often sought refuge in entertainments that seemed to mock his fragility. Chroniclers describe evenings where music filled his chambers, not solemn hymns, but songs of love and desire, performed by troubadours and minstrels. Sometimes jesters joined the company, their humor coarse, their antics exaggerated. To the chroniclers, These moments seemed unbecoming of a king whose strength was failing. They wrote of him lingering too long in the company of performers, of laughter echoing from his chambers, while matters of governance remained unattended. Perhaps Henry sought escape in these hours, relief from the constant reminder of his frailty. Yet the chroniclers, always drawn to moral lessons, painted these evenings as weakness, as perversion of order. A sickly king drowning his troubles not in prayer or discipline, but in laughter and entertainment. Thus, the evening glow in Castile became associated not with dignity, but with indulgence. And Henry, though not remembered as cruel, carried into history the image of a king whose evenings were filled with frivolity rather than strength. A century later, another Castilian ruler, Alfonso XI, turned the evening hours into a stage of scandal in a very different way. Unlike Henry, Alfonso was vigorous, strong, and commanding. But his evenings were not spent with his queen, Maria of Portugal. Instead, they were dominated by his mistress, Leonor de Guzman. What might have remained private was made public by the king's openness. At feasts, Leonor was often seated in places of honor, her presence eclipsing that of the queen. In evening entertainments, she sat at his side, their closeness undeniable in the torchlight of the hall. The courtiers saw it, the chroniclers wrote it, and scandal became inevitable. Leonor bore him many children, and Alfonso's affection for her shaped not only his evenings, but his politics. In the quiet hours after feasts, he granted her favors, lands, and influence, gestures that echoed far beyond the chamber doors. To the queen's supporters, these evenings were humiliations, reminders that the king's heart and attention were elsewhere. When Alfonso died, Leonor's prominence provoked vengeance. She was imprisoned and executed by the queen's orders. Yet in memory, those torchlit evenings where she sat beside him remained symbols of a king who allowed personal desire to overturn public dignity. With Henry III and Alfonso XI, we see two different kinds of evening scandal. For Henry, it was indulgence in entertainments that seemed trivial, a fragile king mocked by his own laughter. For Alfonso, it was the bold display of love, the public enthronement of a mistress within the glow of the court. Both reveal the same truth. The evening hours, softer and more intimate than the rituals of day, were the hours when kings revealed themselves most clearly. Their choices, whether of music or of companions, became mirrors of their souls, and in the eyes of chroniclers, proof of perversion. The sun has fully set. The last glow of twilight has faded from the sky, and within the palace, the halls are lit by torches and the soft glow of candelabra. The feast has ended. The music has softened. But the night is far from still. These are the hours when the first customers of the night arrive. They come not to buy and sell in coins, but to trade in favors, in whispers, in intimacy. Some come seeking lands or titles. Others come seeking the king's affection. Still others arrive out of curiosity, or ambition, or longing. And the king, loosened by wine or wearied by the long day, often received them in ways that gave rise to scandal. Some of the first to approach the king after dusk were petitioners, nobles or envoys who had waited all day for a word in private. In daylight, their requests might be refused before the council. But at night, when the mood was softer, they hoped the king might be more generous. Chroniclers tell of Edward II granting favors to his beloved Gaveston in these hours, while other nobles were sent away bitter. Richard II, too, was accused of granting lands and privileges late at night, his favorites hovering nearby, his judgment clouded by indulgence. The scandal here was not in the granting of favors itself. Kings always rewarded service. It was in the timing, the secrecy, the sense that these gifts were given not for loyalty to the crown, but for loyalty to the body of the king himself. As the night deepened, mistresses often became the true customers of the evening. Queens were seldom present in these hours. They remained in their own chambers, bound by dignity and distance. Mistresses, however, entered quietly, escorted by servants who knew better than to speak. Alfonso XI of Castile received Leonor de Guzman openly, her presence at night a continuation of her dominance at day. Louis I of France, centuries later, was rumored to meet his women in hidden rooms, his superstitious mind surrounding them with talismans and charms. Even in England, Henry VIII, though later than our medieval frame, made no secret of his late-night visits, his mistresses elevated as queens in all but name. To the chroniclers, these nightly encounters became symbols of perversion, not because desire was unnatural, but because it was displayed too openly, allowed to shape politics and patronage. Not all who entered after dusk were mistresses. Some were male favorites, whose presence carried its own charge of scandal. Richard II and Robert de Vere were said to linger together long after the feast ended, their closeness illuminated by firelight. Edward II and Piers Gaveston, too, were accused of passing the night in companionship, their bond interpreted by chroniclers as indulgence that bordered on sin. In these hours, the chroniclers' pens grew sharpest, for what happened in private chambers was rarely witnessed directly. It was imagined, exaggerated, and written as truth. Thus, the first customers of the night became, in memory, embodiments of perversion, whether or not their actions matched the rumors. The night also belonged to entertainers. Jesters, dancers, and musicians performed long after dusk, their humor growing looser, their songs more daring. Kings who lingered too long with such company were judged harshly, as though laughter at night revealed corruption in the soul. Charles VI of France was mocked for enjoying foolish entertainments even as his kingdom trembled. Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, drunk in taverns, laughed too loudly with common companions. Chroniclers turned these moments into moral lessons. Kings who exchanged dignity for laughter in the night invited downfall. We must not forget the servants, who saw most and told most. They carried wine into chambers, brought cushions to benches, lit candles at doors. They noticed who entered, who lingered, who left late. They whispered to one another, and their whispers became the seeds of rumor. Thus the scandal of the night was born not only from kings, but from those who watched them. The first customers of the night were never truly unseen. In Scotland, James IV was remembered as a king of contrasts, pious in his devotion, yet playful in his indulgences. He confessed his sins regularly, even performing acts of penance. Yet the nights of his court were filled with entertainments that blurred the lines between sacred kingship and playful excess. Chroniclers and later storytellers spoke of his fondness for masquerades. At night, when the torches burned low, James and his companions would don masks and costumes, some as saints, some as shepherds, some as figures of jest. They played at being other people, wandering the halls or gardens in disguise, laughing at the confusion they caused. To some, these masquerades were harmless diversion. To others, they were scandal. For in a world where kingship was sacred, the sight of a ruler dressing as a commoner, or worse, as a fool, seemed perverse. The masquerade inverted order. The king should be himself, the embodiment of stability. In masking his face, James unsettled the dignity of his crown. It is easy to imagine the scene. The hall filled with flickering torchlight, the sound of flutes echoing, Courtiers masked in painted faces, laughter spilling into the midnight air. Yet beneath the laughter, there was unease. Chroniclers wrote of these nights as indulgence, as evidence that the king blurred duty with frivolity. What James enjoyed as play, history recorded as scandal. If James IV's nights were filled with laughter, those of Charles II of Navarre, called Charles the Bad, were filled with whispers. His reign in the 14th century was haunted by treachery, plots, and betrayals, many of which unfolded not in daylight councils, but in secret meetings held at night. Chroniclers wrote of him receiving envoys in darkened chambers, making promises by candlelight, shifting alliances in whispers that could not be traced. To them, his very habit of nighttime intrigue was a perversion, a twisting of kingship into secrecy, a preference for shadows over sunlight. Charles's reputation grew darker with each tale. It was said he plotted murders over midnight wine, arranged betrayals under the cover of stars, and welcomed the first customers of the night, not as mistresses or companions, but as agents of conspiracy. In this way, the scandal of his evenings was not sensual, but political. He was remembered not as a man of desire, but as a man of plots. And to medieval chroniclers, this too was a form of perversion, a turning away from the honesty expected of rulers. With James IV of Scotland and Charles II of Navarre, we see how the first customers of the night could take very different forms. For James, they were masked companions, courtiers indulging in games and laughter. His scandal was playfulness, the crown made frivolous in torchlight. For Charles, they were agents of intrigue, envoys and conspirators weaving treachery in silence. His scandal was secrecy, the crown made dangerous in shadows. In both, the night became the mirror of the king's soul. What in day might have seemed ordinary, companionship, counsel, conversation, at night took on a darker, stranger tone. The torchlight made every gesture suspect, every whisper scandalous. The hour is late now. The torches have burned low, their smoke curling against the rafters of the great hall. The musicians have laid aside their instruments, the jesters their caps. Even the kitchens are quiet, their fires banked to ash. Servants slip away to their pallets, and silence descends upon the palace. It is in this silence, the stillness of the deep night, that kings often revealed the strangest, most intimate, and most scandalous aspects of their lives. For some kings, the deep night was a time of solitude. They sat alone, candlelight flickering across the walls of their chambers, lost in thought. Chroniclers described Richard II as pacing restlessly, unable to sleep, his mind filled with suspicion and fear. Charles VI of France, in his madness, sometimes wandered the corridors at night, convinced he was made of glass, terrified of shattering if touched. These lonely wanderings were remembered not as human frailty, but as perversion of kingship, a king awake while his people slept, lost in fears and fancies rather than guiding the realm. For others, the night was not solitude, but indulgence. The privacy of midnight provided opportunity for lovers and favorites to enter chambers unseen. Chroniclers, of course, seldom resisted embellishment. Edward II was accused of sharing his bed with Gaveston in the dark hours. Alfonso XI of Castile of summoning Leonor de Guzman long after the queen had retired. Wenceslas IV of Bohemia of staggering drunkenly into bed with companions after hours of tavern revelry. The truth of these tales is uncertain, but to the medieval imagination, midnight encounters symbolized disorder. The king's bed was thought to be the bed of the kingdom. To pervert it was to endanger all. Some kings filled the midnight hours with ritual. Louis I of France, centuries later, was infamous for his superstitions. Chroniclers wrote of him surrounding himself with amulets, charms, and relics, whispering prayers to saints while also consulting astrologers in the secret hours of the night. To the clergy, this mixture of devotion and sorcery seemed perverse, a king torn between heaven and superstition. In earlier centuries, it was said that Philip IV of France, the Fair, preferred to hold some of his most secret councils at night, issuing judgments in candlelit chambers. This habit gave rise to rumors of cruelty and occult practices, though he was in truth more political than mystical. Yet because he chose midnight rather than daylight, his decisions were remembered as ominous, even sinister. Chroniclers also delighted in describing kings haunted by nightmares. Richard II, they wrote, saw visions of betrayal in his sleep, waking in terror. Henry III of France was said to dream of assassins, his fears shaping the rituals of his nightly hours. Dreams, to the medieval mind, were not private shadows. They were messages, omens of judgment, and when kings confessed them, chroniclers treated them as signs of divine displeasure. Thus, even the restless tossing of a king in bed became scandal. His dreams, whispered to confessors or servants, were inked as proof that God was sending warnings to a sinful ruler. We must remember that kings were rarely alone. Even at night, servants watched. They tended fires, carried water, and stood guard at chamber doors. These servants saw who entered and who left, who whispered and who lingered. They noticed when the king wept, when he raged, when he laughed too softly in the company of another. In the morning, these details became whispers, and whispers became chronicles. Thus, the deep night hours, though cloaked in darkness, were never truly private. Every act, no matter how small, might one day be remembered as a scandal. Together, we walked through many halls, through chambers, gardens, taverns, and torchlit feasts. We followed the kings from the morning ritual to the silence of the dead of night. And again, we found them surrounded not only by courtiers and companions, but also by whispers. The time had come to end these long journeys. The kings we have spoken of, Edward II and Richard II of England, Charles VI and Philip IV of France, Henry III and Alfonso XI of Castile, Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, James IV of Scotland, and others, all had reputations tainted by indulgence, eccentricity, or desire. However, if we look more closely, we will see that the scandal was not always in what they did. It was in what was remembered, written, and repeated. Chroniclers, with their pens, transformed indulgence into perversion, laughter into folly, intimacy into depravity. Private embraces became public stains. Missed advice became evidence of sin. A banquet became a sermon on gluttony. Thus, scandal was not so much about the kingdom itself as about the telling of stories. It was a mirror in which the fears and expectations of society were reflected. The word perversion in medieval chronicles often meant nothing more than a deviation from the order. A king who loved the wrong person, who feasted too freely, who laughed too loudly, who believed in omens or spells, he was considered a disturber of the balance of the kingdom. But what do we find beneath this moral language? We find men. Lonely, burdened men, sitting in their chambers late at night. Men who craved companionship, who sought salvation in laughter, who believed in signs, who indulged their appetites. Kingship exacerbated their vices, but did not erase their humanity. Perhaps the real perversion lay not in their desire, but in their belief that rulers should be more than mere men. Over and over again, as the hours of day and night in our history passed, we have seen the loneliness of kings. always surrounded by eyes and ears, they could never act without being seen, never desire without being judged. Their bodies, their beds, their tables, even their dreams became objects of public interest. No wonder they strayed from the right path. No wonder they clung to favorites, mistresses, or strange rituals. For who else could understand the burden of wearing a crown that weighed not only on the head, but also on the soul? What is most striking is how these scandals outlived the kings themselves. The strange death of Edward II, the madness of Charles VI, the drunkenness of Wenceslas, Alfonso's mistress, these stories are remembered centuries later. While their laws, their taxes, their treaties are often forgotten, it also tells us something about human memory. We remember not the balance sheets of history, but its shadows. We remember the whispers, the rumors, the scandal. And so the so-called perversions of kings have become as much a part of monarchy as crowns and thrones. So, to conclude the last chapter of history, let us return to the image with which we began. The king sits in the great hall, the firelight flickering, his companions around him, the chroniclers watching in silence. We see him not as a monster or a saint, but as a man, imperfect, indulgent, restless, searching. His scandal is our history, his perversion is our lesson, and his humanity, when stripped of the heavy robes of judgment, is not so different from our own. And now, dear listener, I invite you to let history fade. Like the last torch in a medieval hall, let the whispers die down. Let the kings return to their tombs, their reputations faintly heard in the distance. If you have found solace in this journey through history, I kindly remind you to subscribe to this channel so that you can come back for more stories, slowly told in the night. Perhaps you will also leave a comment, sharing which king lingered in your thoughts the most, or which story lulled you the most. And for now, close your eyes. The court is silent. The scandal is over. The story is complete. And the night is finally yours.